Welcome to the third video in a three-part series on proofs for God's existence. I am Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican philosopher, theologian, and author of the Summa Theologica. I'm the author of the 5 Ways, 5 related arguments that each prove God's existence. In the previous 2 videos, I laid the groundwork for this video, summarizing what I argued in the opening articles of question 2 of my Summa. Links to my actual writings are below. Although many people do not believe in God today, there are only 2 arguments that apparently prove God's non-existence. Both are highlighted in my Summa. The first objection is commonly known as the problem of evil. I imagine you are already aware of this objection.
I'll take it from here, Thomas. It's obvious that there is much evil in the world. Philosophers know that evil comes in 2 varieties. Natural evil is, as the name suggests, the kind of harm that comes from nature, like hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and countless illnesses, cancer, heart disease, plagues, and the like. Moral evil is the kind of harm people choose to do to each other, like stealing, lying, murder, and abuse. Unfortunately, we have all experienced these evil in our lives. Some have suffered more than others, but the existence of evil cannot be denied. But here's the problem. The abundant examples of evil in the universe prove that a perfect God, which is how Christians, Jews, and Muslims define God, can't exist in the same universe. Why? Because a perfect God would know that the evil is taking place since he's all-knowing, have the power to stop it since he's all-powerful, and want to put an end to it since he's all-good. But God hasn't put an end to evil. Why? Either because he doesn't know such an evil is taking place, or he doesn't have the power to stop it, or because he just doesn't care. Either way, God isn't what believers say he is. God could be kind of smart, might have a lot of power, and may generally be loving, but he can't be perfect in any of those things, which is how believers describe God. And so, such a God cannot exist.
I like that argument.
I know you do.
The second argument against God's existence takes a different approach, which has even greater resonance in today's scientific age. Here it is.
God is superfluous. Everything with matter that exists can be explained by natural, not supernatural, causes. Likewise, everything that is not physical in existence, things like an idea or a choice, can be explained by human reason or will, which are in themselves natural causes. Therefore, there is no reason to imagine that God exists, since we all can now, or one day will, be explained by science. A quick review of human history will explain why belief in God was so popular. Many centuries ago, people believed in God because they needed God to explain why disasters happen in the universe and why people make bad choices. For example, why was there a storm at sea? Because Poseidon and Zeus are at war. And why do so many people make so many bad choices, like lying to a significant other or murdering someone? Because they think that mysterious and divine forces are at work, and that these evil powers make us do what we don't want to do. Uneducated and non-scientific people liked these answers because they helped them make sense of what they didn't understand and felt powerless to control. God was just another convenient explanation for the mysteries of life that made no sense. The idea of God calmed their fears and promised someone was in control. But the once mysterious forces in the universe can now be explained by natural accounts through the sciences of physics and psychology. In short, the idea of God is superfluous in our modern age. We no longer need God to explain the gaps in our knowledge, or to give troubling events a richer significance or deeper meaning. God is just a relic of the past and a crutch we no longer need.
Admittedly, those are powerful arguments, but I clearly reject both objections in my Summa Theologica. But before I show the errors of these arguments, I'm curious to learn, which do you think is the better argument? Which do you think has greater force? Which provides more evidence that God does not exist? In my conversations with people today, an overwhelming percentage say that the second argument, the one that claims God is superfluous, is the more damning argument. I think this is so because we all live in a scientific age that believes natural explanations explain everything. That is, a great number of people believe that supernatural explanations are not only unneeded, but impossible. I strongly disagree and think this second objection, although very common, is exceptionally weak. Why? Because all natural explanations must be traced back to their cause. The physics of nature successfully explains why a hurricane is blowing, but I ask, what accounts for the physics of nature? Likewise, psychology might explain the choices we make, but what accounts for human psychology? God is not superfluous, but necessary if other causes exist. I recognize that some viewers might object to the claims I just made, but the arguments I will soon give should make clear why I believe what I said. The problem of evil, however, is a formidable objection to God's existence. If there is any reason not to believe in God, this would be it.
Father Aquinas, the problem of evil, although a very challenging objection, does not successfully prove that God does not exist. God is perfect in knowledge, power, and goodness. God is so perfect. In fact, God brings good out of even the worst events or choices. That takes true power, knowledge, and goodness. It is important to understand that God does not cause evil, and that God does not want evil. But God does allow evil to happen, because that allowed evil ultimately results in a far greater good. For instance, God might allow the tragic death of a loved one if that death encourages one of the bereaved to work for a medical cure, which saves countless more lives. The pain felt by the loved one is real, that can't be ignored. But the good experienced collectively by all is far greater. Likewise, God allows us to make terrible choices because doing so teaches us to make the right and the more significant choices later. Every loss is tragic and evil really exists, but when seen from God's eternal point of view and not from our own suffering, the end result of every evil produces more good than bad. In short, God is so good, so knowledgeable, and so powerful that he allows evil to exist so the greater good results. If you want a more modern account of this solution, I recommend you read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, who gives a powerful and personal argument in defense of God's goodness.
Thank you, Boethius, for answering the objection. But isn't your response to the problem of evil a little too simplistic? And forgive me, my friend, but aren't you denying the harsh reality of the real world? Aren't you asking everyone to imagine the world is only filled with rainbows and unicorns?
No, I think not. I am not denying that evil is real, or that many are suffering terribly. I am just explaining that we don't always understand what is happening in the moment. I trust that your viewers, like me, have occasionally looked back upon the most difficult moments in their lives and later realized, given enough time, that the painful event actually led to an unexpected good. For example, I have often heard that someone's battle with cancer, as painful and scary as it was, gave them a greater joy following their recovery. And I know of several people who were fired from their jobs, who later, unexpectedly, found better employment and more happiness. In that way, they came to realize that getting fired from the inferior job was actually a good thing. Although the pain of any loss is real, in time, we often come to recognize that the loss we suffered was a good thing, since it allowed for better things to happen. Because God is eternal and understands the future in ways we cannot, God allows evil so greater good comes about. To make the same point differently, I think Any parents who protect their children from every possible danger would be bad parents. No good parent would cause their child to suffer, but loving parents do sometimes let their toddlers stumble and fall. Why? So their children can learn from their mistakes, so they can learn to walk and run. Likewise, God allows us to suffer, so a greater good will result. As strange as it might sound to us when we are suffering, the challenges we face often make us better, even if we don't enjoy the challenge itself.
Yes, but sometimes we never experience any good coming from tragic events. When someone is murdered, for example, they can't experience any more good in this life.
True, we don't always experience the later benefit ourselves. Sometimes our suffering never improves. However, history does show that the suffering of one generation often ensures the happiness of many future generations. For example, several tragic earthquakes in the mid-20th century caused great suffering, but they also spurred engineers to design safer buildings, which have drastically reduced the number of earthquake-related deaths today. The Holocaust was a massive evil that produced tremendous pain, and it deserves our strongest condemnation. But if I am right, God allowed even such intense suffering because he knew that a greater good will come about. Now I, of course, lack God's wisdom, and I cannot name the particular goods that will follow from such horrific evils. But God's perfect goodness, power, and knowledge gives me confidence that such good will come about. So it is my hope that the horrors of the Holocaust will teach humanity to fight against racism, intolerance, and bigotry, and humanity will never experience such evil again. That would be a very good thing.
Thank you, Boethius, for sharing your answer to this difficult problem. I recognize your solution requires a mature perspective that is not easily found, and that a brief account here cannot answer all objections. Perhaps you can return to this channel to share more details later, or viewers can read your Consolation of Philosophy for themselves.
Thank you. I hope this summary of my ideas helped answer the objection known as the problem of evil, and I would love to return to first-person philosophy if my schedule allows it. Unfortunately, I'm a little short on time, but for now, I'll let you return to the issue at hand, how to prove God's existence. Until later, goodbye.
Now, each of my 5 ways is based on the same type of argument. Substituting letters for more complex thoughts, the argument looks like this. If P did not exist, then Q could not have existed. Q does exist. Therefore, P must exist. Here's the same type of argument, but with fully articulated sentences. If there were never any active volcanoes, there would be no pumice stones. Pumice stones do exist, therefore there were active volcanoes. Do you recognize that the structure, or what logicians call the form of the argument, is the same for both arguments? That is, do you see the same pattern? Namely, the first line of both arguments, logicians call this the opening premise, makes the claim that if one thing didn't exist, then a second thing would not exist. Then the arguments go on to point out in the second premise that the second thing does exist, and that leads to the conclusion that the first thing must also exist. Do you see that? The interesting point about this type of argument is that its form guarantees that the conclusion necessarily follows from its premises. Or, to say it another way, the way the argument is structured means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Logicians call such arguments valid. Are you not convinced that such arguments are valid? Try it out. If it is true that there would be no pumice stones if there were no active volcanoes, and if it is true that there are pumice stones, is there any way the claim there were active volcanoes is false? No. If you accept the truth of the first 2 claims, you must also accept the conclusion is true. Unless, of course, you want to deny the power of logic and admit you are irrational. Now, the challenge in evaluating such arguments is often in proving the premises are true. But if the premises of a valid argument are proven true, if the one you are debating accepts that the premises are true, then every rational person must also accept the conclusion.
Yeah? Well, that's just like, your opinion, man.
Dude, it is always a pleasure to converse with his dudeness, Duder, El Duderino. But dude, that's not just my opinion. That's how logic works. If any argument is structured in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. And if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. That is what is called a sound argument, and you must accept its conclusion, or you have to deny that you are a rational being.
Okay. Whatever.
Dude, like it or not, logic has rules. This isn't the 60s. Let us look at another valid argument with the exact same form. If there is no God, then the effects that only God could produce would not exist. The effects that only God could produce do exist. Therefore, God exists. Do you accept the first line is true? Most people have no problem with it, since it is a simple conditional sentence stating that one thing leads to another. If there is no A, then things that need A to exist would not exist. Makes sense, right? How about the second line? Is that true? Well, the second line is much harder for many people to accept as true. Some people need help to understand the truth of this premise. A big part of each of my 5 ways is doing just that, pointing out that some effects exist in the universe that only God could produce. But, as explained above, once someone accepts the truth of both premises, I have effectively proven that God exists. How? Well, once again, thanks to the structure of the argument given. If you accept that the first 2 premises are true, then logic demands that you also accept the conclusion is true. That is the power of logic. But before I prove to you that the second premise is true, and that is the key to each of the 5 ways, and essentially the goal of this video series, let me remind you of a number of different points that you already know and accept to be true, although you might not have noticed it. First, the Law of Non-contradiction states that it is not possible that something be both true and not true at the same time and in the same manner. For example, no one can claim that a table is entirely made of wood and entirely made of metal at the same time and manner. Any table may be made of both wood and metal, and a wood table may be replaced with metal parts over time, but contradictory claims about the table cannot both be true. The law of non-contradiction also means that no one can logically claim God exists and God does not exist in the exact same way. Only one of those claims can be true. So, when discussing the existence of God, either the theist is right or the atheist is right. Both parties cannot be correct unless you are willing to drastically abandon the most fundamental terms of logic. The law of non-contradiction cannot be denied. Second, nothing happens without a reason. That is, when we notice something changes or comes in or out of existence, we always know that it happened for a reason, even if we do not know or understand the reason perfectly. For example, we all know that something is powering our laptops, even if most of us don't really know how electricity works. In a similar way, if a miniature pink elephant suddenly appeared on your desk, you must agree that it appeared for some reason, even if you do not know how or why it appeared. Perhaps you fell asleep and someone snuck in your room. Maybe you were drunk or on drugs. Maybe someone invented transporter technology. You might not know the cause, but you and I both know there must be a cause. Nothing happens without a reason. The universe likewise did not just start without a cause. To say it came into existence without a cause is nonsensical. You have no evidence to support this claim, and even more importantly, you cannot make it without violating a principle you know works for every other cause. The universe must have a cause. Third, we can trust our common sense sensory experience that things truly exist, move, and are caused. Yes, sometimes our senses deceive us, as when a straight stick looks bent in a glass of water, or when we think we see water at the end of a highway, but we understand the difference between those types of illusions and the regular sense experiences that dominate our day. So when we see things move, appear, or disappear from our field of vision, cause something to change or the like, we trust that what we are sensing is real, and we are not foolish to do so. Yes, like Descartes, we can question even what we see and understand clearly, but the philosophical exercise only goes so far. Our senses, although flawed, are remarkably trustworthy. We can trust that things exist and that they change. To deny that is to deny the most fundamental of all truths. Fourth, there must be a first cause in every real series of causes. This may take a moment to understand, but you know this to be true. Although it is possible to always add or subtract one more number to a potential series, like a number line, it is not possible to infinitely go back in an actual series or a series of real, actual things. Eventually, you must reach the beginning. This means there must be a starting point for every actual, not potential, series. For example, every chandelier hanging from a chain must have a first link in that chain that is attached to a fixed point. If there wasn't a first link, there couldn't be a second or a third. In the same way, every ladder must have a bottom rung that is resting on a fixed point. Without the first rung, there wouldn't be any other rungs. Or to say the same thing differently, without the first in every actual series, it would be impossible to reach the end of the same series. It is important to note that this means when you have reached the end of any actual series, like the bottom of a chandelier's chain or the top of a ladder, you know there had to have been a first cause. Simply put, the existence of an end of an actual series proves the existence of the first in that series. Let us test this claim by looking at motion. Isn't every real motion dependent upon a previous moving mover? Newton said as much in his first law of motion. If correct, and I think it is, that means that everything in motion has been put in motion by a previous cause. For example, the locomotive has put the train cars in motion. The interesting question, however, is what started that engine in motion? And what started that motion? And what started that motion? And what? Can this going back to an earlier motion go on forever? No. According to the principle we are discussing, there must be a first motion that started all motion. And this first motion must itself not be moved by anything else, or it wouldn't be the first motion. Understand? If you do, we are now ready to discuss the argument of motion, or the first of the 5 ways. So let's get moving. I give this argument first because it is the most manifest. That is, everyone is aware that things are moving. Birds fly, rain falls, and people dance and throw balls. Things move. So here's the first of the 5 ways, the argument from motion. The universe is in motion. Whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For example, if a person doesn't throw the ball cannot move itself. There must be an actual beginning of the motion of the universe. That is, the universe did not start without a cause. However, the cause of the motion of the universe must not be caused to move by another. That is, this one remarkable mover that started all motion cannot itself be set in motion. This starter of motion must exist. This unmoved mover must exist. That is what we call God. Therefore, God must exist. What do you think? Can you find any flaw in the structure of the argument? I think not, since this argument is valid, since it has the exact form or arrangement between premises and the conclusion as the other valid arguments discussed earlier. And since you accept the argument is valid, then what about the premises? Can you find one that is false? Or even one where you do not know if it is true? You cannot if you accepted the 4 points we just discussed. So, the argument is valid, and all the premises are true. Given the rules of logic, the conclusion must also be true. God must exist. It is very important to note what I am not arguing here. I am not yet arguing that God knows about us or cares for us. At this point, I am willing to allow that the deist position may be the correct one. And I am not arguing that Jesus is God. Those arguments will come later in my Summa. I am only arguing that a being exists as the unmoved first mover of all motions in the universe. This being stands apart as different from all creation, and yet remains intimately tied to all existence as the one who puts all things in motion. This being is what both theists and atheists mean by God. That being must exist. I am not accepting this conclusion because I am a Christian or because I want God to exist. Logic and the very nature of the universe demand every logical person accepts the conclusion as true. Additional arguments about God and our relationship with God can be made, but they follow later. We cannot discuss what God is until after we prove that God is. Now, if you find yourself resisting the conclusion of this argument, don't worry. Go over the argument again, and I'm confident that the strength of the argument will become more clear. Do not let any fear you might have of accepting the conclusion force you to deny it. You are a rational being, so you must accept what the argument logically demands you must. I recognize that I just gave you a brief version of the full argument. Each of the 5 ways are actually best described as summaries of particular types of proof. You might want more detailed arguments. Wonderful! Here's the good news. What I give in one short paragraph here, I later offer in my Summa Contra Gentiles in 31 paragraphs. You can read that argument if you wish. The link is below. But the argument here is sufficient. God exists. Interestingly, if for some reason you don't think the first way works as advertised, that is not a problem. Remember, I've given you 5 similar arguments, and each reached the same conclusion in different ways. So here's the second of the 5 ways, the argument from Efficient Causality, which is focused on the creation of things. Efficient causes are the causes of what they make. For example, painters are the efficient causes of their paintings, and bakers are the efficient causes of their cakes. That being said, the universe is filled with things that exist. Everything that exists has a cause. For example, every machine has a maker, and every person has parents. There must be a first cause of the universe, because there cannot be an infinite regression of actual efficient causes. The universe did not cause itself, and this means that there must be one remarkable thing that started all causation, but is itself not caused by anything else. This cause of all things must exist. That is what we call God. Therefore, God must exist. This argument proves that something rather remarkable must exist, a being that causes all things to exist but is not caused by anything else itself. Why? Because if such a being did not exist, then nothing else could exist. Motion might be one of the easiest things for others to see and comprehend, but the necessary relationship between a known cause and its efficient cause is also extremely clear. In short, the universe exists and something had to bring it into existence. That something, which has the power to bring existence out of non-existence, is what everyone calls God. For centuries, modern science denied creation ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Following Aristotle, scientists in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries thought that the matter of the universe always existed. But early in the 20th century, the scientific evidence became more and more clear that the universe started with a Big Bang about 13.7 billion years ago. At the risk of sounding vulgar and disrespectful, if science is right and the universe started with a Big Bang, then doesn't that mean there has to be a Big Banger? And that is exactly what everyone means by God, the one who caused the existence of all things. I am personally very glad that science eventually came to understand what the Bible has said from the beginning, that there was a beginning. And although scientists are loath to make theological claims, and rightly so, for as scientists they are not theologians or members of any particular church, synagogue, or mosque, what they discover about the natural world often points to God, the creator of the world. Remember the line from Scripture I quoted earlier? It fits perfectly here. The invisible things of Him are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. I think it is also important to clarify that only God is properly called the Creator. All other creative acts are actually just an agent changing matter in one form into another, as when an artist sculpts a block of marble into a sculpture. The artist isn't actually creating, she is just making, as remarkable as her talent is. Only God creates, which is properly defined as making something out of nothing. Truly, such a powerful being, one that has the power to create what wasn't there before, is worthy of our praise. The third way requires some deep thinking, for it focuses on the difference between what is necessary and what is a mere possibility. Do you know the difference? Things that are possible may or may not be. They may or may not act. Possible things always have the potential to change, since they could be other than what they are now. Possible things are all contingent beings as well, for they depend upon other things for their existence. But necessary things are metaphysically completely opposite of contingent things. Necessary beings do not change, for by definition, they must always remain as they are. How do these definitions connect to God's existence? Let me show you the argument from necessity. The universe is filled with contingent things. Given enough time, every possibility must eventually be actualized, including the possibility that all contingent beings, the totality of all possible things, would not exist. This means that if it is possible for everything not to be, then at one time there would be nothing in existence. This also means that nothing would be in existence now, since what exists only comes to be because of something already in existence. But these claims are impossible, since things clearly are in existence. Therefore, not all things are contingent things. Or, to say it another way, there must be at least one necessary being that cannot not exist. But every necessary being either has its necessity caused by itself or by another. However, it is impossible that the necessity of all necessary beings be caused by other necessary beings. For, as proven earlier, there are no infinite series of actual causes. Therefore, there must be one and only one necessary being that is the cause of its own necessity, and the cause of the necessity in other necessary beings. That is what we call God. Therefore, God must exist. This third way is admittedly a difficult argument for many to grasp, but it hinges on a rather simple point. If everything could fall out of existence, then there must be one thing that must always be, or there would be nothing at all. This one unique being stands apart from all other things. For that necessary being which we call God always was, and always is, and always will be. The fourth way, the argument from perfection, might appear very odd to the modern thinker today, for the modern mind typically thinks that all values are subjective. That is, the modern age thinks that value judgments cannot be judgments of fact. For example, a human being, according to many modern thinkers, does not intrinsically have more value than an ape. I disagree with this way of thinking, since I recognize that to have being does not simply mean to exist or not to exist, but to have an essence. Apes are wonderful creatures, but their essence does not equal the essence of a human being. Human beings have more dignity. Why? Because human nature is closer to the perfection found in living things, since humans have greater rational capacities than apes. I recognize that my comments here may be turning some modern viewers against this fourth way, even before I present it. But here's the fourth way's main point. You cannot successfully judge what is more or less unless an absolute standard exists as your reference. That means you cannot properly determine something is lacking a perfection unless perfection actually exists. Is this the perfect argument? You be the judge. Some things are more and others less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are always judged against some maximum standard. For example, something is more or less cold in reference to absolute zero. Likewise, if everything is to be judged in regard to its being, goodness, and all other perfections, then a being that is perfect in its being, goodness, and all the like must exist. Everyone calls this perfect being God. God must exist. And here's the final argument, the fifth way, which is commonly known as the argument from design. In my experience, many non-philosophers are especially fond of this argument. It's short and sweet, sort of like me, and has an intuitively obvious impact. The universe is well ordered. Everything, even things without intelligence or will, act for some reasonable end. These things always act, or nearly always act, in the same way, so as to reach the best end. Oak trees, for example, grow tall and spread their seeds. However, such non-intelligent agents cannot reach their end unless guided by some being with knowledge and intelligence. Arrows, for example, will not consistently hit their mark unless shot there by an archer. This means that the order of the natural world does not happen by chance, but by design. This designer of the universe must exist. This is what we call God. Therefore, God must exist. Many associate this argument, or a version of it, with Paley's famous watchmaker argument, which was popularized centuries after my argument. In short, Paley argues, if you find a pocket watch which runs in a remarkably orderly fashion, it is reasonable to conclude that there is also a watchmaker. Many recognize the remarkable order in the natural world. However, others point to apparently random events like thunderstorms and plagues. But these events are actually part of the natural order of God. A forest fire, for example, may appear like a destructive force working against the design of nature, but fire is actually part of the cycle of growth of a forest. Congested forests are not productive, and fire allows for new growth. Some trees, for example, only drop their seeds and continue their species in the heat of a fire. Modern science has revealed the incredible degree of order in the universe. For example, if the explosion of the Big Bang was 1/1,000,000th of a degree cooler or warmer, the carbon molecule would not have developed. And without carbon, there would be no life in the universe. That's evidence of a plan, which requires a planner. Some atheists may want to argue that some things just happen without reason or a plan, like the formation of life in the universe. But this claim requires a blind faith in chance, which is ironically anti-scientific. The existence of God, the creator, designer, has much more evidence, as explained in these 5 ways, than the belief of the atheist that there is no God. So what do you think? Did I deliver as promised? Did any one of these 5 arguments convince you that God exists? Why? I'm especially curious to learn which one of the 5 you like best. Everyone has their favorite for a variety of different reasons. The great news is that you only need one argument to work for you to believe in God. Which one worked for you? If you are not convinced, I would like to know why. The YouTube comment section is not where one typically goes for thoughtful conversation, but nevertheless, I look forward to hearing from you. Please be respectful to others and recognize that we are all striving to learn the truth. We can only learn from each other when we assume the role of fellow learners and do not treat those we disagree with as enemies. Please express what you like about the 5 ways and share your concerns and questions. I do plan to keep an eye on the comments and reply. And perhaps in time, I could make another video where I clarify any obscure points and answer your objections. Or even better, I invite you to discuss the issue with interested friends. Share the relevant articles in the Summa and the links to these videos, and enjoy one of the true pleasures of this world, a rich and thoughtful conversation with another thoughtful person about an important idea. And I recommend you have this conversation over a meal to make it even more enjoyable. I think theists, agnostics, and atheists can all agree on one thing: a nice pasta dish with a good glass of wine and rich conversation is heavenly. Thank you for your attention. I hope that we can one day continue our conversation. God bless. Ciao.